So my theme this afternoon is the rise of authoritarian sentiment in our world, alas, and the pressure under which democracy as a concept, as a system, as a practice in our world, the pressure that democracy is under. And there is an obvious connection between the two, because as authoritarianism rises, so democracies become more fragile. But when you dig into the matter, you find that it's not exactly like a pair of balances, more authoritarianism here, less democracy there, because there are some places in our world where all the forms of democracy continue. An example would be Hungary under Viktor Orban. What happens there is that they still have all the institutions and the judiciary and parliament and elections from time to time. In fact, there are elections coming up very soon there. But those institutions and the practices associated with democracy have been hollowed out. What Orban has been able to do is he's restricted the franchise, so only people more inclined to vote for him than for anybody else.
Talking and removing something.
Oh, that's very nice.
I wasn't sure how tall you were.
Okay. We could do a tango together up here. It would be more entertaining for the Thank you. So what he's done is he's sort of dug out the institutions in order to be able to hang on to power. And this is what authoritarians do, is they find a way of manipulating things so that they can keep those sticky hands of theirs on the levers of control. And I'm afraid that the tragedy which we see unfolding before us, and of course there are many when we think about all the horrors that are going on in the Gulf at the moment, and we think about what's happening in Ukraine. But among the bad things is the fact that the United States of America is going very rapidly down the same path as Hungary and some other countries in the world are going. Now, I have to apologize that I've got to mention even the name of this man who, I've got to be completely neutral about him, of course, obviously, and just say that he's completely and utterly ghastly, Mr. Trump. But, he's been very busy. When I say he, of course, it's not at all clear that he's intelligent enough to be doing it. So it must be the people behind him who are doing this, trying to manipulate the franchise. As you see, they're trying to get plenty of people off the electoral roll. He has suborned the Supreme Court. They now just more or less do, not always, but most of the time, what he wants. The Republican Party in the United States has control of both houses of Congress, and they just, lie on their backs with their legs in the air and do what he wants. And as a result, of course, the fragility of American democracy has become very apparent. And if things go on along this path, then the possibility of a more authoritarian way of doing things will become entrenched. Trump might even perhaps consider trying to do a third term as president, although he is a little superannuated, so he might not quite make it to the end of a third term. But at any rate, it is a worry. It's a worry not least because it presents a model and opportunities for other countries where would-be authoritarians think that they might be able to do the same thing, follow the same pattern and get the same result. And we see in Germany, in France, in Italy, and alas, in the United Kingdom, we see far-right parties who are getting quite a lot of traction among voters. So we have to ask ourselves the question, firstly, why is it worth defending democracy anyway? We have to remind ourselves of why that matters, because those of us who have had the great good fortune, really, to live through a very unusual period in history, relatively peaceful for those of us in Western-style democracies, relatively prosperous, I would say more than relatively prosperous when I look around the central coast of Australia, and also relatively progressive. I mean, our views about social policy, about gays, for example, about women's rights, about the control that women have over their fertility and their choices. These things have been very progressive over the last so many decades. And indeed, those of us who have lived in the West since the Second World War have seen things move in a direction that on the whole feels like the right direction. Now, however, in the course of this last decade, 5 to 10 years or so, we see things going in reverse and going back to what, alas, in the course of history at any rate, has been the norm, which is times of difficulty, times where, because of economic and social pressures, political organizations tend to get more controlling, more repressive, where some of the advances that have been made in social and economic respects look as if they're being channeled in the wrong direction. One example of it, of course, is that since the advent of neoliberal economics back in the 1980s, the inequality gap in our world has grown hugely. I mean, inequality now is absolutely staggering when you think about the number of people who are so ultra high net worth in comparison to the fact that the median wage level of people in the middle class, indeed the majority really of people in our societies, have only seen a modest relative increase in the value of their incomes. And so this inequality gap has become huge, and the problem with inequality is that it is socially toxic. Eventually it begins to cause difficulties, strains. Populist politicians of the right-wing populists, are able to exploit this fact. So they say to people who feel that they're being left behind, or they're being disadvantaged in some way, or they just are so far behind the curve that they could never themselves hope to become very wealthy. They say to them, you have been cheated, and here are these elites in society which have been able to benefit so much, so vote for us. Of course, it will be the last time you vote once we've taken over, but at any rate, we can use your disaffection to get into power, and then we'll run things our way. And that is one of the great dangers of what happens with inequality. And just really to drive home the point about inequality in our world, let me remind you of this. Ask yourself the question, what is the difference between $1 million and $1 billion? You can conceptualize that difference, have a sort of mental grasp of what it means. Well, here's how to do it. Sorry, 1 million seconds on your watch is 2 weeks, roughly. 1 billion seconds on your watch is 32 years. So there's a big difference between $1 million and $1 billion, okay? A huge difference. And you ask yourself the question, some of these billionaires, like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, people like that, they don't just have one measly billion, they've got several hundred billion. Look at Elon Musk, he's just been granted a $1 trillion package by Tesla recently. Not, of course, in asset terms and dependent on future earnings and growth of the value of the company and so forth, but still, there it is. I mean, it is a staggering figure to think about. And even if you had just one measly $1 billion, ask yourself the question, how could you spend it all in a lifetime? I mean, how many private jets can you fly in all at once? Or how many private yachts can you float in all at once? How many houses can you live in? I mean, most of you here probably have a measly 2 or 3, you know, but if you were a billionaire, you might have them all over the place, in Paris and London and New York and so on. You can imagine. Anyway, inequality, a very bad thing, and it is the result of what has happened over the last half century or so in our Western economies, where it comes attached to a number of other considerations. For example, disparities in income, disparities in wealth in our societies are not an accident. They're not something natural like the growth of a plant. They are a matter of choice. Choice about taxation levels, choice about regulation of business, choices about just what a society is going to do for those who are least capable of managing the complexities of modern society, people who find it a struggle to make headway, to make something of themselves or for themselves in society. Now, I often point out to people that I have no problem at all with people being rich, even very rich. Indeed, I would quite like to be very rich. I mean, I often, when I buy my lottery ticket, you know, and I'm lying in bed at night, and I think to myself, you know, I'm a modest enough fellow, a million would be, no, hang on, no, 5 million, no, 10 million. And then by the time I've got to sleep, I've gone up to 50 million. That's what I'm hoping I'm going to win the thing. But so I don't mind the idea of anybody being rich, not at all. Just providing nobody is sleeping on the street every night in all seasons. Let people be as rich as they like, providing there are not people looking for something to eat in the rubbish bin. The fact that in our advanced economies that is the norm, that there are people living in conspicuous luxury while other people are living on the street, that is a scandal, because it is the result of choices made about what the society is prepared to pool in the way of resources, what it regards as the most basic, decent level of provision for our fellow citizens. These are matters of choice. And these matters of choice are heavily influenced by people at the top end of the scale. Why? Because they can donate to political parties, because they have influence and access, and because they can have an effect on the choices that are made about levels of taxation. And notice this as well, you know, those of you in this audience who are billionaires, well, you probably have most of your cash, you know, in some tax haven somewhere. It's an astonishing fact, you know, that a society, an economy, a country will educate people, will make sure that basic literacy and numeracy is there, so that, for example, people in business can employ people, they can have a workforce which is sufficiently competent and adequate and knowledgeable, will provide policing, will provide a system of law to ensure that patents are observed and protected, a system of law in which, when there are disputes over things like contracts and so on, there can be a resolution. So the whole infrastructure of a society makes successful business possible. And then some people who become very, very successful in business, they don't pay back into the society from which they benefit. They put their money offshore in tax havens. Hundreds of billions of dollars are taken away from countries, especially, you know, emerging market countries, and put into tax havens and not paid back in the form of taxation to benefit the society in question. And this is just, I mention all this, it sounds as if I'm a rabid, you know, communist or something, but I just mention it because it is a fact of our world, which is one strand in this tangled web of reasons why it is that democracy is under pressure. And so this brings me to my main theme about authoritarianism and democracy. Authoritarian regimes will favor people who want the system to be so organized that they can benefit maximally, where everybody else is regarded as, in effect, a kind of conscript of the system. So in a democracy, of course, we think everybody should have a voice, everybody should have a place, everybody should have a chance in a democracy. That's the utopian ideal. Doesn't actually work out like that in practice most of the time, but at any rate, it has much more chance of working out in practice in a democracy than it does in an authoritarian regime, where special interests, the special interest of wealth or the special interest of a particular political party, decides how everybody else is going to live and what their quality of life and kind of life is going to be. So, Why is democracy worth defending? Well, because, and this is something you see we take so for granted, those of us who have lived in democracies all our lives, it's because in a democracy, no matter what exact form and shape it takes, and of course democracies take different forms, but fundamentally democracies defend the civil liberties of the people who live in them and provide a basic rule of law. And both those things are tremendously important, and they're connected because, of course, the rule of law protects our civil liberties. What do I mean by civil liberties? Well, I mean our right to congregate with people, get together with people on a sunny Saturday afternoon. You're all mad, by the way, it's a lovely day outside. Get together with a bunch of people and listen to a talk, form a political party, set up a book club, all that kind of thing. Not told by the authorities who you can associate with and who you can't. So you can aggregate with others who are like-minded. You have a degree of privacy. That there are some limits as to how far people can dig into your bank account and medical records and peer through your windows in your home. You have the opportunity largely to have opinions and to express them and discuss them with other people. You have some part to play in making a choice over the direction of public policy in your country through the ballot box. I mean, these are civil liberties which are so important, in fact, to the possibility, the chance of having a life that belongs to you, your own life. Civil liberties constitute a kind of space around the individual where how we want to live, what we want to do, the choices we want to make, have a much greater opportunity to find expression than if you live in a regime which tells you what you're to do, what you're allowed to think, who you can associate with, even where you can live, and so on. Which, of course, as you know, is how things are in authoritarian regimes. It's how they were in Soviet Russia and in Eastern Europe. That's how they are in North Korea. And I mean, they are extreme examples of very repressive and controlling societies. And the contrast that our democratic societies makes with those authoritarian societies is a very marked one. We all take it for granted. We've forgotten just how important these things are to us until we lose them. And generally speaking, when we do find that we've lost them, it's a bit late because we weren't paying attention and we weren't standing up and saying, hang on a second. I'll give you an example. In the United Kingdom, just recently, this current government and the one just before it cracked down on people protesting about has been happening in Gaza, to the extent that they made protests there illegal, took people to court and imprisoned people for protesting again about what's happening in Gaza. Now, whatever you personally think about what's been happening in Gaza, the mere fact of arresting people and putting them in prison because they're protesting over it is shocking. And that is in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland today. Well, I mean, that is a shock, and it's an example of how all the little cracks and fissures in the fabric of our democratic order begin to appear. And you know what the poet Tennyson said? He said, "'Tis the little rift within the lute that by and by will make the music mute." And you have to watch out for that when things start to go in the wrong direction. What direction are they going in? Well, they're going in the authoritarian direction. And our civil liberties, therefore, are being challenged. The liberty of protest to be challenged in that way in a country which, in the past at any rate, always held it up as a place of great liberal sentiment, small l liberal sentiment, is a shocking fact. The rule of law. Well, now I know you were all reading Livy in bed last night, his History of Rome, and therefore you will remember that at the very beginning of Book 2 of the Ab Urbe Condita, because you were reading it in Latin as well. I mean, this is Wagstaffe, after all. Well, you may remember that at the very beginning of Book 2 of the History of Rome, he says, when we Romans threw out the kings, the haughty kings, you may remember the Tarquins, remember the rape of Lucretia and all that. When they threw out the Tarquins, we replaced rule by men with the rule of law. And that is what made the Roman Republic for a number of centuries until the rule by men returned in the form of the empire. But that's what made the Roman Republic great, that it was a place where they agreed the laws and they lived by the laws. The rule of law, not by the whims of some dictatorial character. And we all know what Lord Acton said, you know, power corrupts. And the more powerful somebody becomes, the more power they get into their hands, the more corrupt the possibilities of how they behave become. Whereas the rule of law sets down how things are to be done, how conflicts are to be resolved, how remedies are to be achieved when anybody has been harmed or injured, their freedom to accuse, the freedom to defend against accusations. I mean, all these things are fundamental to a good order of society. So the rule of law is tremendously important. Civil liberties and the rule of law are the central features of democracy. Now, of course, democracy has never been perfect anywhere outside of Australia anyway. So we know that there are, you know, that it, just by its own nature, in fact, it faces challenges. I mean, after all, if you have a dictator in charge, things get done pretty quickly. Nobody argues because they're not allowed to. But in a democracy, we're always debating and disagreeing and what have you. You know, I remember a few years ago, it was just about 2008 or 2008, 2009, I was invited, a great privilege of being invited by the United Nations Development Agency to go to Bhutan, which had just had this rather extraordinary thing happen, which is that the previous king of Bhutan decided that he wanted to make his country a democracy. And against the will of his people, he made it a democracy. It's a bit ironic, but at any rate. He told his courtiers that they had to divide into two political parties and have an election, which they did. And so a new government had been formed with the prime minister and 8 other ministers. It's a very small country, so they didn't have to have a very big government. And then the UNDA invited a group of us to go and pontificate on the question of what a democracy is. And the theme of my talk there was, democracies are noisy. They're noisy because of discussion and debate and disagreement and the fact that we wrestle with one another to decide what to do and what direction to go in. Tyrannies are silent. The level of noise, the decibel level in a society is a mark of health. Whereas a society in which there's no discussion because it's not allowed, where everybody just, you know, hops to it and does what the authorities and the security services impose, there you hear silence. By the way, little footnote, I have to tell you that the Bhutanese are completely charming people. The Minister of Information, he was the Minister of many things actually, but his main role was he was the Minister of Information. And he made a lovely speech in which he said, we in Bhutan have one television channel and one newspaper as a means for getting information to the population. But actually we don't even need them because we Bhutanese are very good at gossip. We're so good at gossip that we all know who is sleeping with whom. And we even know who they're going to sleep with next. So they were very charming. Anyway, so the idea of a democratic order is one which, on the face of it, at any rate, looks a bit tumultuous, you know, because people are disagreeing and there is a debate going on all the time. But as I say, that is a mark of health. Now, the most famous definition of democracy ever given was given by Abraham Lincoln in November 1863, right in the middle of the American Civil War, after the terrible, terrible Battle of Gettysburg, which was slaughterous. I mean, so many soldiers died in that terrible battle. And after it, this great cemetery was laid out for the soldiers, the dead of the Union Army. And 2 speeches were made at that ceremony. The first was in a very, 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 very long speech by somebody who is quite rightly forgotten. And the other was a very, very, very short speech by Abraham Lincoln. In fact, if you look at the text of that speech, it's about a paragraph long. And in it he said, we on the Union side are fighting this war to defend, and then by implication democracy, he doesn't actually use the word, but to defend government of the people, by the people, for the people. Government of the people, by the people, for the people. Lovely, lovely definition, until you dig into it a bit. Government of the people, well, they're the people, everybody. Man, woman, slave, free, child, whoever. Okay, everybody. Government of the people. Government by the people, well, who are the people by whom government is done? Well, for one thing, the people who have the vote. Well, who were they in November 1863? White men who owned property. So they were the ones who made decisions about what the government was going to look like and what policies it was going to follow. Government for the people? Well, who is government going to be for? So you get a political party into office, and obviously they're going to ensure that whatever public policy proposals they implement are not going to disfavor the people who voted for them or the people who donated to their party campaigning. So the for the people, or the people who supported the political party in power, the by the people, are the people who've got the vote, and the of the people are all the people. But the people, in all the three different cases, are not the same people, all right? So you have to ask yourself, well, how is a democracy to be so organized that there are as many by the people in the of the people, so that the for the people can be the of the people? That's what you want. You want to so organize matters so that it can work like that. And no system of democracy is perfect. There are always compromises, different voting systems in over 50 countries in the world, 50 democracies in the world. You have the Westminster model, as it's called. As it happens, Australia is a Westminster model democracy, so is the United States of America. So still, just about, is the UK. And with adaptations and modifications, so you have modified your electoral system here a bit. It's not a straightforward first past the post, even though until pretty recently, and I say this with diffidence as a visitor to your beautiful shores, but until fairly recently at any rate, even though you have a voting system which has now admitted into Parliament groups of independents and Teals and so on, it had the effect at any rate of producing a binary two-party in practice kind of system. That's the system in the UK. The third and fourth and other parties get barely a look in over time. The two major parties are very dominant. And in the United States of America, Democrats and the Republicans completely divide the political space between them, take up all the political oxygen between them. No third or any other party can get anything like a look in. Over 90% of seats in the House of Representatives never change hands among the parties. Always when there's a change of majority in the House of Representatives, it's very small number of seats. And this is because of the tight grip that the political parties have on the system, and of course gerrymandering. The congressional districts, the constituencies are organized to capture just the voters for your party. And those, of course, are political decisions. So the result is that you have a two-party system in the United States, which in the past, from time to time, succeeded in relatively bipartisan decisions being made, but which, under extreme pressures of people like Trump and so on, has become so divided, so polarized, the abyss between the two parties is so great that it's almost the condition of civil war. I mean, really, the opposition between the two parties now is bitter, so bitter, that it's very hard for them to reach agreements. And this is why you see, budget difficulties, budgets not being able to be agreed there. And of course, this is being exacerbated by the Trump presidency, because he is pouring fuel on that fire. So when you think about the of the people, by the people, for the people, you have to think about the structures. And you also have to bear in mind that there have been two things have happened in the course of the development of democratic systems since the 18th century, the late 18th century, which are now such that they are in need of reform. All our democracies in the world have got a bit creaky because the structures were built for, times gone by, and now they need to adapt and be a bit more responsive to how things are happening in a world of social media and the internet, and the fact that our societies have become much less homogeneous. Our societies are no longer such that there is a real majority for anything. All societies now are collections, congeries of minorities, including minorities of one. You remember The Life of Brian, that film, where Brian says, we're all different, and everybody in the crowd says, we're all different, except for the one fellow who says, well, I'm not. Well, there are more of that fellow now. There are more people who feel the diversity of our societies. And just a year or two ago, I published a book on the wokeism thing, about trying to make society less prejudiced and more inclusive and what have you. I'm a big defender of that aspect of wokeism. Of course, one can't defend the extremes that people go in for. Although, by the way, on the wokist thing, the extremists on the wokeism side are sort of counterbalanced by the extremists on the anti-wokist side, the neo-Nazis, the white supremacists, the misogynists, the manosphere people, who don't get as much attention as the extremists on the wokist side. Why? Well, because most of the press is on this side of the divide, not necessarily that they support neo-Nazism and everything, but at any rate, it's a very skewed debate. What you have to remember is that what really underlies the whole wokeism thing is fighting against discrimination, against sexism, against racism, against ageism, against disableism, fighting on behalf of people who until very, very recently in history did not even have the right to ask for their rights. People who were so marginalized in society, and now the whole effort to be more inclusive, to give everybody a fair place in society, that is what it's about, really. And you see Trump pushing back against it big time. Closing down diversity and inclusion programs, giving comfort really to people with very unpleasant views, anti-feminist views and racist views and so on. Anyway, I diverge. Get me onto the subject of Trump and we'll be here all the rest of next week. Anyway, so go back to democracy. So there is this precious thing, protecting our civil liberties, making sure that the rule of law obtains. There are the different structures of democracy, different electoral systems and how they actually work in practice. And even though they are imperfect, because very difficult to find perfection anywhere, on the whole, until about now, worked well enough. But as I say, getting creaky, getting to be in need of reform. And there are two things which are important in that. The first of them is well illustrated by thinking a little bit about the American system, the US system. It's a sort of interesting study. The founders of the United States of America were all extremely intelligent, very gifted, very, very well-read and well-educated men. I mean, it's rather remarkable to think that a group of such people should get together and actually construct a new idea, a new system. It may have been more helpful to them if they'd had some women among them, might have pointed out a few things, which they naturally overlooked being men, men alike. So nevertheless, they had this wonderful opportunity. As I say, they were well read, and they had all read Plato. This may have been the other thing you were reading in bed last night. So Plato, in the Republic, Book 8, expresses his deep skepticism about the very idea of democracy, which he regarded as the second worst form of government. The very worst form of government, he said, is tyranny, but democracy will, he said, lead to tyranny, because if you put power into the hands of the people, then because the people are self-interested, short-termist, ignorant, not very altruistic, rivalrous, they tend to disagree among themselves and so on, what you will get is tumult, chaos. They won't be able to decide, they'll argue and all be grabbing as much as they can for themselves. So if you put power into the hands of the people, the result would be a mess. In fact, what you will get is not democracy, it's ochlocracy. Wonderful word that, O-C-H, by the way. Ochlocracy means mob rule. That's what you'll get. And because of the chaos, it will be exhausting and everything will collapse. And therefore, the people will welcome with open arms a tyrant who will come in and restore order and peace. But then, of course, they are stuck with the tyrant. What Plato wanted instead of democracy, and this is one of the relatively few things I agree with him about, actually, is that everything should be run by philosophers. Philosopher kings. So I do agree with him about that. He had this, he was, actually, I have to tell you, that Plato was a bit of an old fascist, really. He said, in our society, we're going to pick all the handsomest boys and the prettiest girls, so they can have babies, so we can bring up, nice-looking children. But people who don't really pass muster in those respects are not allowed to have babies. When the babies are born, they're put into a state kindergarten. And as they grow up, choices are made about which ones are going to be ordinary people, which ones are going to be soldiers, and which ones are going to be philosopher kings. And the philosopher kings, the smart babies, they will, when they become actually philosopher kings, are not allowed to marry or have a family, so they will never be partisan. They will never prefer their own kin, their own offspring to anybody else, so be completely impartial. They won't be allowed to own property or have money, so they can't be bribed. They're not going to be tempted in that way. They're just going to live this rather austere, celibate life and just live, act, decide purely in the interests of the polis. The polis is not the people with the sirens and everything else. It's the political unit, the city-state. So that was his idea. But I mean, really, as you can see, really rather a kind of sort of Soviet-like sort of idea. But the founders of the US had read him, and they had recognized that he had a point about the people. And therefore, they thought that what you need to do is, of course, you must give people the vote, a voice, or at least white men with property, give them the vote, because they have a right and entitlement to have their say about the laws under which they are to live. But in order to get from the choice of the people to good enough government, now isn't that a wonderful phrase? Good enough government actually comes from Aristotle, who was a very, very commonsensical fellow. He realized that you would never get perfection, but it would be okay if you just had good enough government. So to get from voting to good enough government, you have to have good institutions. And those institutions should filter out any bad choices that the people make. This is why Hamilton, as you know, a famous music hall star, Hamilton, one of the founders, designed the Electoral College. And the Electoral College exists in order to evaluate whether the person chosen to be president is a fit person to be the chief magistrate of the land, to quote Hamilton's own words, that is a fit person to be president. And if the people had made a bad choice, then the Electoral College could say no, and they could pick the person they thought would be suitable. Well, you can see how well that works, okay? But it was meant to be the sort of last line of defense to ensure that the government would be conducted by fit people. And they also had all these checks and balances. So you've got House of Representatives, but unfortunately elected on a plurality system. That's first past the post, which is a very, very undemocratic system. The Senate, which is a state's house. Every state sends 2 senators, however populous or unpopulated the state is. And then California and New York states have huge populations. They send 2 senators each. But then the tiny little Midwest states send 2 senators. The result is a permanent small c plus big R for Republican bias in the Senate. So it's not a Democratic House. The president is, there is a popular vote in the presidency, but that popular vote is interpreted in electoral college terms so that from time to time, as happened with Trump against Hillary Clinton back in 2016, he got 3 million fewer votes than Hillary Clinton did, but he became president. So the whole system, which is intended to filter out the popular voice as you go up through the institutions, ends up with it being really rather undemocratic in its structure. And even though the founders thought that the Congress and the Supreme Court and the presidency would be 3 different power centers and able to check and balance one another, what you see today is that if you have a populist president who has packed Congress and who has suborned the Supreme Court by putting his own nominees in there, there's no separation of powers between the Supreme Court and the political process because they are all political appointees. And you know, the sort of perfect storm is when one party possesses all 3 branches and where the president has handpicked, as he has done this time in his administration, a bunch of complete idiots and licksplittles around him who are making a mess of our world. I mean, wrecking ball style, okay, that's what's happening. Now you can put the point this way, you can say, if the United States of America can put Donald J. Trump in the White House, something is badly wrong with that system, that should never happen, that an utterly publicly recognized unfit person, and it's not just prejudice on my part, I mean, there it is, he's a convicted felon. I mean, we all know, we've all heard things, horrible things that he said. We can all see him partying with Mr. Epstein and so on. We know that he's an unfit person, and the fact that the system has allowed that to happen, it not only says not very much about the half of the voters who voted for him, but it also says a lot about the fragility of the system which has allowed it. So that's one illustration of how all around the world in our democracies, the structures need to be looked at. Certainly, the United States of America needs to reform its institutions. That's obvious now with Trump in the White House. But we need to look at our own systems and ask, are they fit for purpose? Are they really working? Do they really find ways of expressing the will of the people? Let me give you an example from a different dispensation in the Netherlands. So as you may know, the Netherlands has a proportional representation system, and it has a very large number of political parties, all of whom get MPs elected. So a whole lot of parties. It usually takes them months after an election to form a government, because the government has to be a coalition government. And people point at that and they say, look at that, the Dutch folks, I mean, that's disastrous. It takes them ages to get a government after an election because they've got this PR, proportional electoral system. I think that it's actually a very good sign. Why? Because lots of different interests, lots of different communities, lots of different parts of society have put their representatives there to get together with others and discuss with them and eventually to agree a public policy platform which will actually serve a larger conglomerate, a larger federation, if you like, of minorities in the society, than if one party gets a majority and between elections rules as a one-party state. That's what happens in the UK. You know, at the moment, we have a Labour government. Now, just as a footnote remark, point out to you that I have so often resigned from the Labour Party. It tells you, sort of, you know, that to rejoin it and then resign because they make me really fed up. And so it goes on. But anyway, we've got a Labour government at the moment, not a very effective one, and poor old Starmer is not doing very well. They've got a big majority in the House of Commons on 35% of the actual votes cast at the last election. Not 35% of the total electorate, but 35% of actual votes cast. Now that is unconscionable. How can they claim any kind of legitimacy on that basis? This is why the first past the post system is so bad. Oh, I'm going on, aren't I? Sorry. By the way, I haven't even begun yet. Okay, well, okay. I'm going to put the brakes on those remarks. I better get back to my other story here. When I'm asked, why is it that our democracies are under pressure, I say there are lots of reasons. Among the ancillary reasons are things like climate change, like immigration pressures, and the fact that anxieties over immigration actually give a lot of fuel to far-right parties who can use that as an excuse for whipping up sentiment. But the four main reasons are these. The first is that because our democratic institutions are getting a bit creaky and out of date, they are no longer quite serving the interests of the people well enough. In particular, in connection with what I started with, which is about inequality and divisions in society. And so people become a bit dissatisfied with the system, and they blame democracy for the fact that they felt left behind, or they're not having enough chance. Standard of living is decreasing, the cost of living is rising, and so on. So they feel dissatisfied with the government, naturally, and therefore with the system. So there's a reason for that, and the reason for that partly is that government in our democracies has become party political government. Government is about politics. Now, I have to say, I watched Prime Minister's Question Times on your ABC television the other day, and I noticed that the opposition asked a question of the minister or the prime minister, and then a member of the governing party will throw a nice soft ball, and it's hit for six, you know, by the minister, and then the opposition asks a question, and then there's a nice soft lob from the governing party, hit for six in the other direction. And it's campaigning all the way through. You don't want your government to be campaigning all the time and for the whole thing to be party political. Well, all the headline issues in the democracies tend to be party political campaigning issues, thinking about the next election, trying to keep the electorate on side. Now, political debate is terribly important. Yes, there has to be that noisy conversation I mentioned earlier. But once a government is formed, government is for the people, not for just those who voted for you. It's government for the people, where the for the people people are all the of the people people, okay? Government should be in service to the people, not telling the people what to do, not being on top, but acting as servants in the best interests of the populace. So party politics, which over the last 150 years has become more and more disciplined. You know, it ends up with MPs not really representing their constituents, but representing the party line. And when that happens in politics, then government becomes infected by politics, and then it's all political, and it's all argument, and they're trying to catch one another out and trip one another up. And so it's not really about the good of the country, and then people in the country are feeling a bit pissed off, or excuse the language, and therefore they feel that it's democracy that's to blame. So that's point number one of the four. The second is international business. I mean, some of the biggest international corporations have annual turnovers, or even indeed annual profits, which are bigger than the GDPs of a lot of countries. These are enormous, powerful, very successful, very often institutions, which are, because they're international and multi-located, are not completely under the control of any one national government. And if their national government tries to put salt on their tails, well, they just move or do something else. But though they're not under the control of national governments, they have a huge influence on national governments because of donation, because of the contribution they make to the country's economy. And so governments tend to pussyfoot around them and do what they want on the whole as much as they can. And so the power of international money, if you like, is very distorting on the internal politics of countries. And that's another factor. Our vote doesn't make any difference to what a big multinational corporation does, and yet what the multinational corporation does has a big effect on us. So that's the second reason. And I go on about it at some length with some very, very interesting facts and figures in the book if you're the kind of person who can't sleep. You'll find that that will really put you to sleep. The third reason is there's a new model on the block. There's a new kid on the block, okay? Look at China. It has been hugely successful in terms of growth and modernization. In fact, it is an extraordinary phenomenon how that country has modernized over the last 30 to 50 years and has become an economic giant and a regional superpower, how they've done it. And they've done it very much by not being a democracy, but being an authoritarian state and being able to institute a state capitalist system. And you can see, therefore, why plenty of politicians and business people in other parts of the world think to themselves, that works rather well, doesn't it? Maybe that's the better way to go. It's not democracy. Everybody arguing and taking time. It takes loads of time to get bills passed through Parliament or something. We just want our own Xi Jinping who says, do it, and then it's done. And this is much more efficient. And it's true, it is more efficient. But you know, inefficiency is a great protector of our liberties. So people look at the Chinese example, or even the Singaporean example, or any example where you have that kind of authoritarian rule, and they say, in our modern, complex, difficult world, what we need is an authoritative voice, a way of cutting through all the red tape and the tangles and the difficulties, is tell everybody to shut up and do the thing which will maximize GDP or our profits or whatever. So there's the third thing is the new model. And the fourth and final thing, you see I'm hurrying up now, is that from outside democracies and from within them, there are people working to subvert them, working to tell us that it's not working, working to say that we should think of an alternative model, the Xi Jinping or the Putin or whatever model. And the propaganda machinery of China and Russia are two examples. And I give you, in the book, I give you the facts and figures and examples of how they do it brilliantly. I mean, they really are masters of this technique of being able to sow doubt and dissension and making us all think, well, they've got a point. Because the Chinese analysis of the failure of the United States institutions is absolutely spot on. But then, of course, the Chinese say, look at our model. What the Chinese have done is they've reinvented the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Remember that? Marx and Lenin and Mao Zedong and so on. Dictatorship of the proletariat, which ostensibly meant that the people, the masses, the workers and the peasants would decide what to do. Whereas really, of course, it's the party that decides what to do. They've changed the term. It means the same thing, but it's got a new name. It's called whole people democracy. So the whole people are the democratic order, and we, the party, are, of course, just articulating their wishes and desires and guiding them and helping them and what have you. So actually no change there except in nomenclature. And that is the argument they're putting about the efficacy of their system, and they have their evidence to show you. Look at what China has done over the last half century. And that seems to some people to be very attractive. Our freedoms in democracy come at the cost of mess and debate and difficulty and what have you. Remember that the sound of silence, the sound of tyranny is silence. Remember that if everything, the metric for everything is money, profit, GDP, and we don't think of other values of personal life, of personal freedom, of privacy, of the choices that we make that make life feel good for us, then we are in danger of not seeing the little cracks, the little fishes, the rift within the lute that will make the music by and by mute.